to the Westminster Institute. I'm Bob Riley, its director. Today we're doing something a little different. I won't be introducing a guest, as today I'm the speaker. At the sufferance of Westminster's founder and chairman of the board, Dr. Patrick Sukhdeo, to whom I sent a copy of my latest book, America on Trial, A Defense of the Founding. Patrick read the book and suggested that I give a Westminster talk about this subject, which otherwise would not have occurred to me. So, fulfilling his kind wish, that's what I'm going to talk about today, America on Trial. Well, I don't think it's news to anyone that America is on trial, whether it's riots in the streets from last summer or attacks in the press from the New York Times 1619 Project or otherwise. In a way, America has always been on trial. Certainly since 1776, at the time of the American Revolution, it was on trial, and at other times afterwards, most particularly during the Civil War in the 1860s. America's been on trial in several world wars and other conflicts, usually ones that somehow involve, on the opponent's side, a denial of America's founding principle, that all people are created equal. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's start at the beginning, and that beginning goes back very far indeed. I asked myself in this book, what ideas made the American founding conceivable? From where did they come? What is their intellectual lineage? Now, the reason I undertook this endeavor was because of a kind of attack that's been leveled against the founding, that it itself is responsible for the depraved conditions in which we find the country today. Everyone pretty much knows that litany, from a supposed homosexual marriage, widespread pornography, drugs, dissolution of the family, etc. Why has this happened to us? Did it happen despite the principles of the American founding or because of them? This one school of thought has developed, indeed is popular in some Christian conservative circles, that it's the founding's fault. Why? Because the founding contained a time-release poison pill, and we are its victims. Why? Because, they say, the founding was invested with a radical Enlightenment principle of individual autonomy. This was constrained so long as religion remained strong in the United States, but as religion has begun receding in the American population, these principles of radical individual autonomy have come to the fore, and they are responsible for the condition in which we find ourselves. Of course, we can see this interpretation of the founding actually articulated in certain Supreme Court decisions, particularly those that were enunciated by then Supreme Court Justice Anthony Kennedy, who frequently speaks of man's autonomy, of his right to create for himself the meaning of the universe. And through the individual autonomy interpretation of the American founding, he curiously found in it the right to homosexual acts, and then the right to homosexual marriage. And of course, preceding those was the right to abortion. And now later, absent Justice Kennedy, we had the decision regarding transgenderism as a right that had to be protected under equal protection. Now, it's interesting that sectors of both the right and left agree that this radical individual autonomy was in the American founding. The left and others like Justice Kennedy embrace it. People who are more conservative deplore it, but agree that it's there, that the founding's the problem. This book contests this interpretation and indeed posits that the historical evidence and a close examination of the founders of what they thought and did makes this interpretation insupportable. Now, it's interesting that this interpretation goes back really no further than the Enlightenment era in the 17th century. But the roots of the American founding and the ideas that made it conceivable are far older than that. And in this book, I trace them. It's a long journey going back several thousand years, but I think without doing so, the case can't be made that the American founding was indeed sound, that its principles were morally good and are defensible and need defense. I begin the book by examining what life was like before Greek philosophy, before the monotheism of the Jews, and before Christianity. I examine in short what tribal life was like. And we find in there a conception that the members of the tribe had of themselves only as members of a tribe, adhering to the ways of their fathers and to the gods of the tribe. And the leaders of those tribes usually had some association, perhaps a direct lineage to one of the gods of the tribe. And so the ruler was perhaps a semi-divine person. And actually it was only through the ruler that the members of that tribe had access to the gods. Only he knew the magic words of the prayers to which the gods would listen to guarantee the harvests or to guarantee victory in battle. No one thought of themselves outside of their tribal lineage. And they knew members of other tribes only by the names of those tribes. They had nothing in common with them. And if indeed they were in a state of war with them, which was a typical feature of tribal life, the tribe that won would usually kill all the males and enslave the females and the children, if indeed they didn't kill everyone. Now, it wouldn't have occurred to either side in such a struggle that there's something wrong with this, because the losing side would have done absolutely the same thing had they won. There was no moral vocabulary, in other words, in the tribal universe that would have suggested that this was wrong. Now, when Greek philosophy dawned upon mankind, say the 6th, 5th century AD, observations were made of the following kind. There seems to be an order in the world. And this order appears to be rational. And through our reason, we can apprehend this order and come to understand it. Now, the first pre-Socratic philosopher to use the word logos to define the divine intelligence he discerned that was behind this rational order was Heraclitus. He said this logos, which is the Greek word for reason or word, was what imparted to the world this rational order and gave indeed our reason the means through which to come to understand it. And therefore, we ought to live according to this logos, conform our lives to it, to live, in other words, reasonably according to the laws that are apprehended in nature. Aristotle, of course, took this much further by arriving at a notion of the laws of nature. Laws of nature are involved in the essence of things, what makes them what they are and why they can't be something other than what they are. and the ends toward which their nature directs them. In the plant world, let's say an acorn. An acorn has the nature of an oak, and given the proper conditions will grow into an oak unless something impedes it, a drought or too acidic soil. Otherwise, we know that this acorn will reach a state of completion, what Aristotle would call its perfection, when it is a fully grown oak. In other words, all the potentiality of that oak is reached when it arrives at completion, at full maturity. And that's how we know what a thing is. Now, in the world of inanimate nature or animal nature, things act according to their natures. They have no choice but to do otherwise. Only when it comes to man can he make a choice regarding whether to act in conformity with his nature or to undertake acts that are against it. Now, just as Aristotle would say water is good for an oak tree, overly acidic soil is bad for it, when we come to understand what the end of man is, we can say the actions of man that he undertakes to reach his completion, his perfection, are good for him. And those actions he undertakes that impede his reaching his perfection are bad for him. In other words, only with man, because he has free will and reason, is there a moral vocabulary of good and evil. And we know then through man's nature that reason is morally normative for him. He is obligated to act according to those moral norms that will bring him to the state of perfection. What are those? Aristotle, like many other great philosophers, said that the end of man is happiness. Well, how is this happiness achieved? He said it's achieved through the practice of virtue. Therefore, those acts which impede the virtuous acts are bad for him. Those are vices. Now, this discovery that man has a nature and that reason is morally normative for him instills man with the capacity to now recognize another person as a human being, because he knows now what a human being is. He knows that all men's souls are ordered to this same good, this life of virtue and the end of happiness. Now, this was expanded by Socrates and others to the question of justice. Can we apprehend what is just through our reason? Or are we reduced to the tribal consideration of justice as simply the mores of the tribe or the ways of the fathers of that tribe, other tribes having different mores and different fathers, and therefore nothing in common with each other? Or do we have a justice that transcends the tribal order, that transcends the Greek polis, so that we can say that justice is the same everywhere for everyone? And indeed, Aristotle posited that natural law is the same everywhere for everyone. And Socrates gave his life for the proposition that there is an order that transcends the political order in which the good and the just are defined. When this was assimilated and articulated in Rome by the great natural law thinker Cicero, who had such an influence on the American founding, he said there's not one law or one justice in Rome and another in Athens. It's the same everywhere, because human nature is the same everywhere. You can see how this concept exploded the mindset of the tribal world and provided a key to a key foundation stone for the American founding. Now, the other development in the ancient world, which was so profound and was also another essential foundation stone for the American founding, was the monotheism of Judaism. This was an extraordinary development because only the Jews in the Middle East conceived of God as one. They were in a sea of polytheism. All the surrounding cultures were polytheistic, and indeed many of them pantheistic. The Jews alone conceived of God as one, Yahweh. And only they said this God, Yahweh, is transcendent. No other Middle Eastern culture could conceive of their gods as being somehow above the world or the universe. They were within it. Indeed, they're up in the Empyrean, up in the highest part of that universe or world, but they could not think of anything outside of that universe. And indeed, they thought that the world itself was eternal, that it had always existed and always would, and that man was subject to a fate in it, indeed a plaything of these gods, and that things were in this perpetual loop. Everything that could happen would happen, and then it would start all over again. You can see there was sort of an inherent futility to this conception. Now, the Jews' notion of creation cut through this idea. This transcendent God created from nothing. The world was not eternal. He began it. He spoke through his word, and things came into being, as Genesis so majestically announces. And unlike the mythologies of these other Middle Eastern cultures, what they have as creation that comes from some primeval ooze is the result of a conflict, of a fight between gods or between demiurges, a principle of evil and a principle of good, or one of light and one of darkness, and they fight, and the good demiurge subdues the evil demiurge, and thus we have some kind of order in the world. But this order could be temporary, because that principle of evil is still there and in conflict and in struggle with the principle of good, or of matter with spirit, and so forth. So what exists is not entirely good. It's infected with evil or matter or darkness. Only the Jews, again, in Genesis, said no, creation was not born of conflict. It was spoken or loved into being by Yahweh. And everything he made, in contradistinction to these other ancient cultures, everything he made was good. As the refrains of the 6 days of creation end each time with, and God saw that it was good. Everything he made was good. Matter was good. Matter wasn't evil, as the Gnostics thought. And what was especially good in what God made? Man. Why? Because Genesis informs us that man was made in the image and likeness of God. This again was an extraordinarily unique revelation to the Jews. No other ancient mythology contained this concept that man was made in the divine image of God himself. And this invested man with a kind of sacredness, an inviolability, that again was alien to the experience of other Middle Eastern cultures. Man was had as his purpose this relationship with his creator God, who acted toward him providentially. Even though Yahweh was transcendent, he would act within history for the good of his people, the Jews. Now, this monotheism, this creation ex nihilo, the goodness of creation, as you might imagine, creates a greater sense of optimism than the ancient world would otherwise experience because of the inherent futility in their view of things. Salvation history begins with the Jews, which is to say, really, history begins with the Jews. That the loop is broken. Now there's a beginning, there's a trajectory which will reach a final end in God's judgment. So here's the other foundation stone. Also, I've got to add very quickly that the account of evil in Genesis is also unique. It is not in the world, that is, it's not part of the initial creation. Evil enters the world through man's disordered will and through his disobedience. Man's disobedience, of course, leads to his expulsion from the Garden of Eden and into this vale of tears. But this providential God does not abandon man. He promises some resolution to the problem that man has introduced in creation and the promise of a Messiah. As we know in the Old Testament, the prophets indicate who this might be or what he might do. And so within the Jews, this expectation of a Messiah is very keen. Now, the third foundation stone I'd like to address, of course, is Christianity, which saw itself very much as a Jewish religion, as Christ was a Jew. He, of course, claimed to be the Messiah, and that it was through his sacrifice that this reconciliation with God was achieved. The other revelation in Christianity, which had a profound effect, came in the Gospel of St. John, the introduction of which says, the Gospel is in Greek, in the beginning was the Word, but in Greek the word is, of course, logos. Let's keep it for a moment. In the beginning was the Logos, and the Logos was with God, and Logos was God. All things are made through him as Logos. So now we know why there is this rational order in nature, because its creator is himself reason. Now we know, we have this confirmation of Heraclitus's intuition that this divine intelligence behind reality is logos, is reason. And so you have a startling confirmation of this when, let us say, God introduces himself as logos in the Gospel of St. John. Now, the interesting thing about the addition of Christianity to the view we've already provided is that it enhanced or gave a deeper understanding of what this image of God in man meant. Within Christianity is the revelation that the love for each individual person by God is infinite, and that through his mercy and obedience, through God's mercy and man's obedience to God, he can reach an end that man in his natural state could not conceive of. Aristotle couldn't have conceived of it. And that is a personal union with God, in the sense that God offers to man his own divinity and eternal life. Now, the inviolability of the individual person was enhanced by this, and how people ought to behave toward each other had to be considered within the context of this sacredness of the individual person. The other extraordinary thing within Christian revelation is not only that man had this personal relationship with God, our Father, familial relationship, but that his achievement of his end now is outside of the tribe, outside of the political order, outside of the empire. This was an extraordinary conception, again, alien to the ancient world, but for the Jews. Now, in that famous episode in the New Testament, the Pharisees and Herodians try to trip up Jesus by giving him he asks for a denarius because they've asked him whether it's legal to pay taxes to Caesar. Jesus examines the denarius and says, whose image is on it? And they say, Caesar's. And he famously replies, give to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's. And the New Testament records that the crowd acted with astonishment. Indeed, anyone would be astonished because this had never been said before. And it meant, of course, that there was now, let us say, a division of power, the most important division of power that has ever been made. And that is between spiritual power and secular power. Christ acknowledges that there is a secular realm which has its own autonomy or semi-autonomy, in which Caesar, or a secular ruler, legitimately rules. However, there is a spiritual realm in which he does not have power. And this, of course, was at the origin of the famous two swords teaching that was developed early in the Middle Ages. Now, as this teaching began to be articulated as early as the 5th century by Pope Gelasius in a letter to the emperor, it was made clear that the Pope had no authority to interfere in the secular rule by the emperor, nor did the emperor have any right to interfere in the spiritual rule of the Pope. Now, this is the most interesting thing, that this meant that man lived under a dual sovereignty. The sovereignty of the spiritual rule and the sovereignty of the secular rule. In the Middle Ages, this two swords teaching was instantiated to a more articulate and refined degree by the church and the princes and the kings. Now, since these two sovereignties exercised their authority over the same subjects, there's naturally some bumping, and because the borders between the two spheres was not clearly defined except through a process in which each of them undertook this definition. In any case, it was acknowledged by both realms, the spiritual and the secular, that they had their own sovereignties, and this left man. Now, the consequence of these two sovereignties is that neither of them was absolute. Neither of them could claim complete authority over the person. It was a shared authority. Neither of them were absolute. This, of course, created a political space for freedom for medieval man. This may go against the popular imagination, but this indeed was true. Now, there were some other things that affected the development of constitutional principles, or let us say the harbingers of modern constitutional principles in the medieval world that had assimilated these influences from, let's say, Athens, Jerusalem, and of course from Rome, which I use as the term for Christianity. And here is the way they addressed these truths in a way that had a profound political impact. It was generally considered within the Middle Ages that man had been created equal, that he was a rational creature with a free will. Now the question arose, from where did the ruler, the prince of the king, get his authority? Did God invest him directly in a form of the divine right of kings, or not? The near unanimous answer was no. God invested the people with this authority, and it was they, through their consent, who could then provide that authority to the king or the prince. In other words, man's equality was the foundation for the notion of popular sovereignty. If popular sovereignty exists, the conveyance of that authority to the ruler requires the consent of the people. That consent of the people can be expressed in a variety of ways, but it nonetheless comes with a covenant with the ruler. There are conditions which the ruler, the king, the prince must observe so long as they have that right to rule. Popular sovereignty, representation, consent, the legitimacy of the political order in so long as the ruler observes the provisions in the covenant. Now, what if the ruler doesn't? What if he begins ruling tyrannically? Again, the unanimous opinion of the Middle Ages was that people have a right to revolution against tyranny. Now, let me just give you an example of how this was developed. Interestingly enough, it first came within canon law. The Justinian Code from the 6th century was rediscovered in the 11th century. It had a huge impact, particularly on the canonists. And there was a principle within canon law, or let us say a ruling, that said, quod omnes tangit ab omnibus approbari. Now, that is Latin for what touches all must be approved by all. What affects all must be approved by all. This, however, was a principle that applied only to Roman private law. All it meant was that trustees of a property or trustees overseeing a minor had to be unanimous in their agreement for the disposition of that property or the direction of this minor. That's all it meant. It had no application outside of the private law. It certainly had no political application. Now, what these canonists brilliantly did was use this quod omnes tangit principle and applied it to church corporations, which were really the first voluntary corporations, that is, consisted by the agreement of the members of the corporation in history. And how would these church corporations, which meant chapter councils, church councils, other church organizations, religious orders, how were they to rule themselves within this corporation along the lines of the quod omnes tangit principle? And the way it came to be developed, I think, I best give you an example from the Dominican order. St. Dominic called for a convocation of the various Dominican chapters in Europe at which decisions would be made over how the Dominicans would rule themselves. And he asked that each chapter or abbey would send representatives. How would those representatives be selected? By the consent of the monks or Dominicans in that abbey or chapter. Those 2 representatives each, he asked for, would then be invested by those who had selected them with the power to agree or disagree with the proposals at this general conclave. And then if a majority of the conclave, through these representatives, agreed to a proposition, it then became the new rule in the order. And St. Dominic made clear that he himself was subject to these decisions. He was not above them. This conclave was sovereign. And so that's the way the Dominicans ruled themselves from that time forward. Now, this spread to other religious orders, and as the religious orders spread through Europe, particularly the Dominicans to England, you saw the principles by which they conducted their affairs seeping into the civil sphere. And soon the early parliaments would also quote the quote omnes tangit principle, what affects all must be approved by all, particularly when the king would require new revenues, a tax. This was an early instance of the famous cry of the American Revolution, no taxation without representation. And this indeed is where it came from. Curiously enough, it came from canon law in that medieval church and then developed within the civil law in the early parliaments. Now, with this general unanimity that I have described to you, one might wonder, how is it then that we didn't go straight from the Middle Ages without interruption, since these principles were universally accepted, to the American founding? What came between that made indeed an American Revolution necessary? What came late in the Middle Ages was a different conception of reality, indeed a different conception of God as to God's nature, that eventually affected political order and undermined the constitutional principles which we've been laying out here. Let's talk for a moment about William of Ockham, who was a priest, who thought that theology had been compromised by what he called pagan philosophy. That meant Aristotle. Aristotle was the villain. And that God actually was not constrained by the idea man had of what is just, of what is right and wrong. Why? Because God is really pure will and power. He can do anything. God can do anything. He's unconstrained. Now, let's make this clear. In the Middle Ages, most particularly in the thought of Thomas Aquinas, he said about the nature of God that in God's essence, it's the divine intellect that is primary and the divine will is secondary. This means the divine intellect rules, the will follows. The divine intellect conceives of something and the will executes. The word, God said, and then so it was. Now, what William of Ockham did was flip this relationship. He said, no, it's not the divine intellect. It's not reason which is primary, it's will. And the reason is secondary, as only an instrument of that will to find the best way to carry out what the will chooses. The problem with this primacy of the will is that it's impossible to differentiate one act of the will from another if there is no standard outside of that will by which to make a judgment. And that is indeed what Occam was proposing. There is no such standard. The will is predisposed to nothing but itself. This is what we call in theology voluntarism, after voluntas, Greek for will, God's pure will, unconstrained by anything. Now, what this had profound consequences for the notion, Aristotle's notion of nature, natural law. According to Occam, there was no natural law. Why? Because there was no nature. And there was no order in nature because of this. Things just happened as a direct consequence of God's will, and he could change that will at any instance. So that confidence, that reliability in creation that had been developed under Judaism and Christianity up until this time kind of evaporates. Now, the political consequences of this were seen later. It wasn't the intention. Occam was not a politician. It wasn't his intention to have this effect in the political order, but so it developed. And it was manifest particularly in Martin Luther. Luther was an Occamist. He too was a voluntarist. He too, like Occam, believed that man's reason was incapable of knowing right from wrong. According to Occam, this was because if things have no nature, reason is no longer normative. If things have no ends within themselves, one can't say what brings them to perfection and what subverts them from reaching that perfection. That's all gone. Things are good and evil only insofar as God says they are, and for no other reason. There's nothing inherent in an act that makes it good or evil, only if it disobeys what God tells you to do. This you can see is the origin of sola scriptura, Scripture alone. Man has no access to moral knowledge. Luther denounced the ethics of Aristotle as the worst book ever written, and that Aristotle was close to being a devil in human form. Reason, said Luther, was the devil's whore. It no longer gave man access to this rational order. Those two swords that provided the most important separation of powers, the spiritual power and the secular power, was reduced now to one sword. And it was the secular sword, the sword of the prince, that now obtained the spiritual powers. So there was only one sword now. There wasn't a dual sovereignty. The prince became the head of the church. It was to the prince Luther looked for the reform of the churches. It's easy to see where this is going and how it laid the foundations for the divine right of kings. And indeed, Luther believed that the people weren't sovereign. Indeed, they weren't equal. And if they weren't sovereign, certainly their consent was not required in their rule. The king or the prince received his power directly from God, not through the people. And therefore that prince or king was not accountable to the people, but only to God, and could rule the people with laws which he himself was not required to obey. Now, what if that prince began to rule tyrannically? Did people have a recourse, as they all believed in the Middle Ages they did, to revolution against a tyrant? Luther was emphatic in saying, no, they have no such right. It doesn't matter what the prince does, the people don't have a right to revolution. Now, after 1630, he modified this somewhat, but that was the main force of the teaching, and you could see now that every principle of constitutional government articulated in the Middle Ages was denied. And this did lead to the divine right of kings and the concept of an absolutist state. Now, there were two kinds of developments of this. One was a secular absolutist state, as articulated by Thomas Hobbes in his famous book Leviathan, and a divine right of kings, absolutist state, as articulated by King James I in England and by Sir Robert Filmer in his book Patriarcha, which was famous as the most able defense of the divine right of kings. Now, there was opposition to this, and it arose in England in the late Elizabethan period before James I. The first Anglican theologian, Richard Hooker, wrote a profoundly influential book, The Laws of Ecclesiastical Polity, in which he restored Aristotle and Thomas Aquinas to Anglican thought. And by so doing, he restored the status of reason. He was reacting to radical Puritans who were saying, we don't need English common law, we don't need the laws of Parliament, all we need are the laws of Scripture, and we will rule ourselves by those alone. No, said Richard Hooker, reason is able to ascertain the laws of nature, which laws are themselves a form of God's revelation, just as much as the Scriptures are, and that God expects us to use our reason to live reasonably and to create laws which are according to reason. Now, Richard Hooker's defense of reason and his restoration of these medieval constitutional principles had a more or less direct impact on the American founding, because his book, Laws of Ecclesiastical Polity, you can be sure was widespread in the American colonies because the Anglican Church was predominant in about half of those colonies. So the Laws of Ecclesiastical Polity was well known. And also Hooker had a profound effect on two other English thinkers whom we can say had a direct influence on the American founding. One, of course, is John Locke, who refers to and quotes from Hooker frequently in his second treatise. And the other is Algernon Sidney, who in his discourses on government also frequently refers to and quotes from Hooker. Now, I needn't expatiate on Locke's influence on the American founding. It's very famous. Sidney, however, also had a direct and profound influence. He was considered a Republican martyr by the English colonists. Thomas Jefferson recommended Discourses on Government, which he said was the greatest primer on Republican government at the University of Virginia that should be read by all its students. Now, Sidney was a very well-grounded natural law thinker, so we could see within his work everything we have articulated so far in terms of the law of reason, a natural law, and what that leads to in the development of the constitutional principles which he advocated and which the founders of the United States embraced. Now, John Locke was, of course, a fierce opponent of the divine right of kings, and his first treatise is a devastation of the pretensions of Sir Robert Filmer in defending the divine right of kings in Patriarcha. Both he and Sidney were aware of the work of two thinkers, Robert Bellarmine in Italy and Francisco Suarez in France, who had also used natural law and the medieval constitutional principles to attack the pretensions of James I, who was so infuriated with Suarez that he had his works burnt in public by the public executioner, and who was so upset by Bellarmine that he engaged him in an exchange of monographs, a very unusual for a monarch to address a commoner and engage in this back and forth. He felt he had to do it because the arguments of Bellarmine were so powerful. This was acknowledged by Sir Robert Filmer too, because in Patriarcha he had to, quote, give the argument from Bellarmine in order to rebut it. And he did the same thing regarding the arguments of Suarez. Now this is significant because both Sidney and Filmer, this is important because both Sidney and Locke, in their arguments against Filmer's position, were also familiar with what Bellarmine and Suarez were saying because it was in Filmer's book. So it's curious that this Italian cardinal and this Spanish Jesuit had also an influence on this, even if indirectly on the American founding, because Patriarcha, Filmer's argument, was also a book present in the American colonies. In fact, it was present in Thomas Jefferson's library. He had a copy with notes and marked up. So he also was familiar with the natural law and constitutional arguments by Bellarmine and Suarez, as he was, of course, with Locke and with Sidney. So you can see all of these forces against absolutism, against the divine right of kings, conjoined and helping form the minds, the American colonial mind, and the thinking of the founders, so that they rose in 1776 against the expression of absolutism in the British Empire, which had gravitated somewhat from the king, from George III, to the British Parliament, which in the 1760s had passed a law, the Declaratory Act, saying that it could pass any law affecting the colonies. It wasn't restricted on any matter whatsoever, without, of course, the consent of the colonists. This was the battle cry. The colonists then considered themselves, by these same constitutional principles and the rule of reason, the rule of natural law, to have had those rights violated because they were being ruled without their consent. Therefore, their revolution was a restoration of those principles, a restoration of the rule of reason as against the rule of will and power. American legitimacy is based upon that rule of reason, and it's articulated so famously in the Declaration of Independence, where according to the laws of nature and of nature's God, man is created equal and he's endowed with certain inalienable rights, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The Declaration then lists a long set of grievances against George III, each of which involves a transgression against the colonists in matters in which they're being ruled without their consent. Well, in this very concentrated way and condensed way, I've been trying to set the case against those who say that this American founding was based upon some radical Enlightenment individual autonomy, that it was no such thing, that it was a restoration of these ancient principles, that it was a restoration of the rule of reason as against the rule of will, and a restoration of natural law as morally normative in man's behavior. Now, when we arrive at that part of the Declaration that says among these inalienable rights is man's pursuit of happiness, those who say that the founding is infected with this radical individual autonomy say, aha, this pursuit of happiness, that means a libertine state. This leads to transgenderism. Well, no, actually not. The happiness to which the founders referred in the Declaration of Independence was the happiness which Aristotle, Aquinas, Hooker, all of these seminal thinkers to which I have referred, is the object of man's life and is the object of his government. Now, in what does that happiness consist, as we mentioned earlier, in the life of virtue and so forth? And if there is anything about which the American founders agreed, is that virtue was indispensable, most particularly to the Republican form of government which they had chosen. And George Washington famously said in his first inaugural address that there was, quote, an indissoluble union between virtue and happiness. In other words, this happiness could not be pursued but by virtue and a virtuous life. Another thing, and by the way, there were any number of Christian sects. The colonies were overwhelmingly Christian. Despite whether they were Calvinist or Anglican, they all agreed with this. And those few theists, like Franklin, agreed with it too. Virtue was indispensable. And what was the primary source of virtue? Again, here they agreed was religion. So religion was indispensable to the development of virtue, and virtue was indispensable to the Republican form of government. And if you wish to keep this Republican form of government, the virtue of the American citizenry was primary. Therefore, you can see that there's no room for an idea of radical individual autonomy within this, where man gets to make up his own meaning of the universe. No, they said that the meaning of the universe had already been determined by the laws of nature and of nature's God. Its creator had already determined its meaning, and that meaning, this predominantly Christian nation knew, for man was his own end in that God. This is another profound thing about the American founding, that the colonists and the founders never looked to the state to displace religion or to assume upon itself a salvific role where it's the government that is somehow going to save man. No, the government had no such means. It had no such end within itself. Remember, the separation of the secular and the spiritual authority is the most important separation of powers ever made. And it was distinct and kept distinct within the American foundings and within the American Constitution, which made further separations of powers, of course, in the judicial, legislative, and executive to limit that power. Power won't be limited unless there's a conception of the meaning of life which does limit it, and if man's end is in a transcendent God, then the state can't assume these absolute powers or absolute direction in man's life. To make this clear in the book, I have a chapter comparing the French and American revolutions. The French Revolution was essentially different from the American Revolution. It contained a notion of the perfectibility of man that was articulated by the Marquis de Condorcet and others. That man could be perfected, and that the state really was the agent through which this perfection could be reached, so long as the state had sufficient power to direct it. Now, the principal enemy of this enterprise in the French Revolution was, not surprisingly, Christianity itself. And it's why the French revolutionaries undertook the extraordinary campaign of de-Christianization within France. The deportation of 25,000 priests, the slaughter of other priests and nuns on the guillotine, the desecration of churches, knocking crosses off of cemeteries, melting down the church bells for coinage or bullets. To gain an adequate contrast between the French and American revolutions, all one would have to ask oneself is, would a de-Christianization campaign during the American Revolution have been conceivable? Of course not. It was inconceivable. The Declaration and the Constitution were dated in the year of our Lord. Unlike the beginning of the French Republic, unlike the beginning of the French Republic, which began sort of the year zero, began the calendar again. In fact, it changed the calendar to de-Christianize it so that there was no Sunday. There were 10 days to the week and so forth. This was radical. You want radical individual autonomy? Do you want an effort in which man himself reaches a state of self-divinization premised upon the power of the state, which will enforce the programs to make that necessary, albeit in a sea of blood? If you want a prototype for the revolutions that were to follow in the 20th century, that were totalitarian, the Nazis, the Soviets, you have an origin in that French Revolution that provided the prototype for it. And that's how different it was from the American Revolution, which was the principal opponent of those 20th century totalitarianisms that denied the existence of natural law, that denied the equality of all men, one based on racial superiority and the other on class superiority, and that denied, of course, in the case of communism, the existence of God. You see in those totalitarianisms the primacy of force, the primacy of will, as against the primacy of reason. It was articulated in the American Revolution. So I don't think that there is a case that can be made for this critique of the American founding as based upon radical Enlightenment notions of individual autonomy. In the book, I go into some detail about what the American founders actually said that were so contrary to any such notion. And it's why it was a conservative revolution. It's why it returned man to that course of constitutional democratic rule, which had been erupted by the age of absolutism. Well, I want to thank you very much for your patience in listening to this very condensed summary of America on Trial, a defense of the founding. And I again want to thank Patrick Sukhdev for suggesting that I do this. By the way, please go to our Westminster Foundation website, where you will see our other interesting recent videos of lectures on such subjects as Russia, China, and others. And please stay tuned for what we have coming up next. Thank you for joining us.